Hi everybody, wherever you are joining us from around the world for this special International Centre for Journalists Zoominar, webinar, panel discussion, however you like to describe it. Those of you who are joining from within our International Forum for Health Reporting in the context of crisis, that is the crisis that we're now confronting, the COVID-19 pandemic, we are really grateful that you are contributing, finding solidarity, that you're forging collaborations in that space. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the International Centre for Journalists and IJNet, which is the network of journalists that we manage, we are running, as of 3 or 4 weeks ago, a global community online, essentially within a Facebook group at this point, which is designed to link you to credible sources and to one another. So just to recap, that's the Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum, which you'll find on Facebook and via a range of other searches. So again, thanks very much for joining us. This is a special panel discussion, one which originally was planned for the International Centre for Journalists, the International Journalism Festival, I should say, celebration which happens annually in Perugia, which is a big conference of journalists from all around the world, an amazing community. This is effectively a rebooting of that panel featuring the editors I'm about to introduce you to, because of course Italy is still in lockdown. It has been the epicenter of the European outbreak of COVID-19, and Perugia, the city where it's based every year and has been for the past 15 or so years, is indeed affected, and like so many other events around the world, IJF has been cancelled. So we would just like to once again thank that community of journalists as well for continuing to support conversations around the future of journalists at what is an incredibly critical time. So let's get going. We are live webcasting via Zoom, but also via Facebook. And that's why I was giving you a longer introduction there to try to get us up to speed with the technology. So my name's Julie Pizzetti. I'm the Global Director of Research at the International Centre for Journalists, and I'm based in Oxford in the UK. And here I'm joined today by celebrated editors and CEOs from news organisations in the Philippines, South Africa and India. We have Rappler's Maria Ressa, Daily Maverick's Branko Brkic, and The Quint's Ritu Kapur. And all around the world, as I've said, journalists and news organisations like theirs are tackling serious daily risks on the front line of the reporting task of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's been described as an information war as much as it is a pandemic of deadly consequences in terms of human health. And so we'll focus a little bit on that. But these editors and their staff are fighting to report on the human experience of the crisis, from the hospitals to the food queues, and they're also struggling to hold governments and political leaders to account as those states, manage or mismanage, as the case may be, responses to the pandemic. So that includes emergency measures that really risk permanently infringing our human rights and access to information, our privacy. And so we have to put a focus also on threats to freedom of expression and media freedom in this context, and ensure that the watchdog role of the press can continue despite all these limitations. There are also, of course, massive financial pressures on news organisations. We were already facing, as an international community of news media, unprecedented pressures that had disrupted the business model, that had resulted in global threats to media freedom, like surveillance and attacks on journalists, increasingly online violence, a whole range of other threats. But this is really an unprecedented situation where news organisations facing those pressures and more are now at risk of shutdown. People are losing their jobs in newsrooms all over the world. Newsrooms are closing. And as I said, we have what's called a massive infodemic. That's the World Health Organization's term for the disinformation crisis that accompanies this. So the role of independent journalism has really never been more critical, and that goes right to the heart of these newsrooms that we're talking about today. So I'll try to ask as many questions as I can from those of you in the audience. We've got now something like 2,000 members of that global reporting forum. And so please keep the questions coming during the course of the webinar. But let's get going with our special guests this afternoon. Can I start with you, Maria Ressa? Can you tell us how Rappler is experiencing the pandemic in the Philippines? What are your biggest challenges so far, and then how are you trying to combat them?
I think I'll break it into three things. I think the first is just, we are in the end of week 3 of a lockdown that is like lockdown, home quarantine. There are guards and checkpoints. You're allowed to go out to buy groceries. One person from your family, right? Our President Duterte, 2 days ago threatened to shoot anyone who violated quarantine. And then now his press spokesman has gone back and said, no, it's only if you fight back. So this sounds like shades of the drug war. I think there were 3 things I said that that's the context that we're operating in. So week 3, the end of week 3, beginning of week 4. Lockdown's supposed to be lifted April 14th, but it's looking like the exponential curve of the virus is still taking off at that point in time. So we'll probably look at a few more weeks. I think the first was after President Duterte gave his March 12th national address, where he wasn't very coherent, but he said lockdown. And the only thing that was clear was that it had a military and security response, but unclear in terms of everything else. So the first step we did was we said, we have to be clear about what our editorial agenda is. We need context, we need the big picture, we need to understand the virus and its impact on our societies. So that was a guiding principle. Right after he spoke, we sat down and decided we were not going to atomize. We were not going to report the atomized pieces, and we weren't going to report the anger and the fear as much as we would try to focus on what exactly is the context, why, where are we headed, what are the numbers, and then how do you get a whole of nation approach. The second was to look at Rappler's, our people. We're a news organization of 100 people. We had 3 teams who were exposed to people who tested positive. And we can talk about that more later. So people was next. And then the third is business, which isn't last but not least, right? Because the biggest challenge now is going to be not just how your sales is doing for say the first quarter, but do you have enough cash flow? Because as you're talking about flattening the curve of the virus and the disease, we also are going to have to flatten the curve of expenses so that while you're in lockdown where you cannot actually collect money, you're going to make sure that your money is going to last through that period. You have to flatten the curve of your expenses.
So we'll unpack that series of really big challenges, individually, but certainly collectively in a moment. But I just want to give everybody the chance before we get into some of those details to share with us their own experiences. So coming to you, Branko, I mean, South Africa, the government responded with significant force pretty early in terms of international standards for responding to this pandemic. There have been, extensive lockdowns. You're joining us from, essentially the desert in your car where you've been self-isolating. So what are the biggest problems you've faced as the editor and founder of Daily Maverick, which has been around now for 10 years as an online-only entity, in trying to ensure you're able to continue reportage and, bringing information to the public?
Hello, everybody. In some ways, Daily Maverick was kind of made for a crisis like this. We were, for 10 years, we've been suffering so much financially, I've been struggling, that as a result, in 2014 and 2015, we couldn't even afford the offices. So we actually worked from our homes for 2 years. So believe it or not, a big issue was how to get people back into the office once we could afford the office. So now we had to actually tell them not to come to the office, which is kind of ridiculous. But yeah, we were very well positioned for that one because, you know, we are online. We don't have necessarily a need for much physical infrastructure. And we were really lucky that we literally hit the ground running. We issued a couple of weeks ago, 10 days before the lockdown was announced, we issued a directive that it's a stay-at-home work, and you know, the people responded remarkably well. We were also incredibly lucky that in September last year, we started something called Maverick Citizen, which was, we brought in some of the best health journalists and activists in the country. And, you know, we built the team just in time, without actually predicting it. We couldn't have predicted, just in time for the crisis to hit. So we now have this incredible team. We have some of the best medical brains in the country collaborating with us. So we can't really complain from that point of view. You know, this is, I must, in some ways, this is from the journalistic point of view, this is our finest hour. We producing anything between 40 and 50 large features a day. And it's actually, if we have any problem and challenge right now, is struggling to produce them all properly, you know. However, just to follow the points that Maria raised, business, you know, the issue of survival is a clear and present danger, and is a clear and present issues to the majority of media in South Africa, and I suspect the majority of media in globally. We are fine, but it's not going to be easy. And as Maria said, flattening the curve but the you know, the independent media in South Africa is going to struggle, and depending on how long this crisis takes, you will see a great damage done to that you know, sector of media. Having said it, I think also established media is going to suffer quite a bit.
We might leave you there. We're struggling a bit with your connection, Branko, so we'll give it a chance again, to try and catch up.
You know, I'm sorry, so there's a connection.
No, that's okay. No, that's okay. So we'll come to you, Ritu, now. You know, we've seen the images of floods of workers, displaced workers in New Delhi as the shutdown hit, you know, going back to their villages. So there's this incredible human story, a very visceral story coming out of India that is really a reminder to the West, you know, where we're joking about our experiences of lockdown to an extent, and, you know, while trying to manage the extreme stress. But it's so real in the global South in terms of the masses, you know, experience of this. What does that mean for the ways in which you're trying to address coverage? You know, how do you try and reach audiences that are both locked down and on the move, trying to find safety at this point?
You know, it is, you know, just anecdotally to begin with, I was in a conversation with journalists from across the globe a couple of days back, and there was this conversation about, you know, it's time that government now shifted some of their funds or created special corpuses towards media so that, you know, media can survive. And I had to come in and say that, you know, I know that the government here has so many other things to prioritize in terms of funding. Now, this millions of Indians walking thousands of kilometers back home right now just to be able to get to their homes. Not to say that home is a haven for them, but so, you know, you suddenly look at, you know, you're dealing with a lot of financial issues, but you suddenly look at yourself and say that you've got to go out and currently focus on as good a journalism as 100% work from home is letting you do. So while we have made it a voluntary, let journalists volunteer whether they want to step out or not, because even though the numbers from India in terms of the infected and dead are very small, the fear is that that may be a consequence of not testing, not just not testing enough, but testing very, very little. So we'll really know what the real numbers are once the testing really goes up. So we can understand, we have a lot of very young journalists and some of the parents being a little wary of letting them out. But to a lot like Branko said, Daily Maverick is because we're digital only, and because we've always been, we've trained all our journalists to be mobile, using, shooting and editing on their mobile phones. And we also have what we call My Report. Over the last couple of years, we built out our citizen journalism vertical, which is called My Report. And we've seen a lot more people sending in their videos and sending in, their stories from their areas regionally. They have also, some of them have actually also ventured out and shot with some of this migrant labor that's trying to walk back home. So we've actually strangely been very, very rich in our video content. We've also assigned regional areas and states to various reporters who are working from home in Delhi or Mumbai, but they're working. So we're making sure that we have a pan-India coverage via stringers. And we've also partnered with a lot of regional websites to get a lot of regional content from them. So we're doing well. But we've also, because of, we've had to look very quickly at saving costs to begin with. So we've let go of a lot of wires, of, a lot of video feeds that was coming in through wires. So we're now trying to find ways of being on top of news from across the country, even though we, through cost cutting, we've let go of some of the sources of news that we had.
So that's one of the ways you're trying to manage the costs. And we can hear pings coming through for the editors joining us today, because the reality is, even when you're in the middle of a live, globally connected webinar, this crisis, this news reporting function and task goes on. So, so bear with us, everybody, as we try to respond to your questions and deal with the myriad feeds and pings, which is like, even more exaggerated now, I think, in our experience of being journalists and editors. So a question from our audience, from our community, which goes back to what you were saying, Maria, earlier. How do we ensure that we are able to bring accurate data to our audiences? Statistics, and all of you have pointed to this, vital sets of information to help make sense of what's going on around us. They help us, hopefully, to hold governments to account and to ensure that the community is able to understand the incidence of the disease and the mortality rates and so on. So how trustworthy is this data coming from, say, the Duterte government? I mean, this is, of course, back to your experience, Maria, when your struggles with the Philippines government began around inaccurate data connected to the murder with impunity of so-called drug dealers. So what are you doing to try and get to the base of this problem?
So, what's so interesting here is that you don't just have the data of the Philippine government, you have the data of the entire world. And if you're a news group and you subscribe to Tableau, Tableau actually takes in all of the data from Johns Hopkins, and then you can plug that data in, so you can kind of see how your country is doing against the world. Having said that, what's really clear in the Philippines is that not enough testing had been done. 2 Sundays ago, we sat down to try to figure out, how many tests have really happened. And then we did a global map and then charted how many per million, how many tests in each country per million. And then we did a scatter plot, right? In the Philippines, it was at that point, 12 people were being tested for every million Filipinos. So once we had that baseline, we knew that right now only the most serious, the people who were most affected, the people who have to already be hospitalized are the ones that are being tested. And if you look at our numbers today, we now have over 3,000 cases of positive COVID-19. Our death toll has also increased, but we have, because that strategy of testing only the worst has led us to almost a 90% for every, in terms of ratio. I guess that's a long-winded answer to say, we look at the data, we look at what the government has done. Unlike the drug war, we can compare this data to a global norm. And that gives us an idea of exactly, how far or how close are we. I think the other part is you also know the way a pandemic would behave, right? Where globally, I don't think we've really ever, maybe South Korea and China has peaked. It's an exponential curve and then it peaks. And then even China, they're going back. It looks like there's a second wave that's coming in. So a long-winded answer to say, like what we had to do in Rappler was to really make sense of it for ourselves. And the good part here is that we are not alone. We have an entire world. That's positive and negative. The biggest issue right now is if you look at this in a global sense, the world is not going to get over it until the weakest link country finds a solution along with everyone else. We are all literally in this together.
It's all about collaborative responses as well, and we'll come to that. Many of the people watching this afternoon are asking about safety. They're asking questions like, how do we ensure that the journalists we are still sending necessarily out into the environment where people are, leaving en masse from cities, where, they're going into hospitals, wherever they may be, because journalists and news organizations in many settings are still classed as essential services, which is good to I think, recognize. But how are you keeping your staff safe? Branko, I might start with you on that. I know you have, you have real challenges there because reporting in townships, for example, where there are obviously serious risks for infection with people living in very close quarters. What are you doing to try and ensure the safety of your journalists at the moment?
Well, first and foremost, the first thing we always tell them, whatever you do, think of your safety first and foremost. We don't need a story if they get sick, if they get in any way harmed. Our recommendation to them is to stay home. Okay, so we have managed to see in a lockdown country when there's a serious shortage of masks and even hand sanitizers, it's difficult to keep the supply going. So we managed to get some of it to our journalists. And ideally, we just tell them, listen, rely upon your list of contacts. And I think that's something that, Daily Maverick is not necessarily a reporting outfit the way the CNN would have been. We are kind of second layer. We do breaking news, but we don't really do those massive reports. So we rely on this really strong list of contacts we have developed over the last decade, and been very lucky in that regard. Townships, we call them communities as well. Look, right now there's only a few cases there, and literally the entire country right now is holding its breath, and the government is, I have to admit, quite valiantly fighting to stop the spread into the communities, because that would be quite catastrophic, to be honest. Even the few days ago, the President Ramaphosa has announced that they're going to have 10,000 people going into the communities to proactively test. Because as you know, the testing is just about everything in terms of identifying the clusters and then isolating people. South Africa developed these techniques because we had this huge occurrence of HIV/AIDS and the TB. So South Africa is well positioned from quite a few those angles there, because we got the tracing teams are well experienced and well positioned to do the job, and they actually really do a good job. I cannot fault the government in at least the national government health department in doing their best to really aggressively tackle the issue. So perhaps the biggest worry we have these days is, apart from of course the obvious the virus entering the communities, where again that would be really, really bad. The biggest issue is also an abuse of power by the police and the army, and reports of that are coming quite strong, and actually there's more and more of them. So that's where our worry is as well.
Okay.
But we worried that some people will not want to give up their powers after the lockdown is over one day.
Absolutely. And this is a global trend. Unfortunately, we'll come to that next. But I just want to ask you, Ritu, to address the safety question, if you can, because you still have some stringers, some journalists who are mingling as reporters. What are you doing to ensure their safety? What physical safety, emotional safety, psychological safety at this point?
Till yesterday, we had a complete internal lockdown on our journalists going out, with the exception of, I think we did 3 stories, out of which one was done by a reporter in his own society that was sealed. And the other 2 stories have been done by reporters, but we made sure that we were trying to get them as much sanitized gear or equipment to do that, and we made sure that their personal cars were sanitized after that. But it's largely we're telling people not to go out and do stories, and to rely much more on a network of stringers and our citizen journalists. And a lot of people are posting a lot of content on social media, which we are then verifying, and we're then taking their permission. But a lot of text, written articles we are getting through phone conversations and through people, but largely we are staying away from ground reporting to the extent that we can.
And this has been one of your specializations, ground reporting, hasn't it? I mean, being able to go deep into communities to bring depth to your coverage and humanity to your coverage. So this is quite challenging, but at the same time, I'm hearing from all of you that as digital-born organizations, you have these deep networks. You have built, whether it's membership or communities of action, that are designed to try and help your coverage, user-generated coverage from reliable sources. And you just mentioned there as well, Ritu, sourcing stories from social media environments where you're bringing your verification skills, your collaborative verification skills to the fore as well. So we'll come back to that in a minute, because the 2 big questions that the audience wants asked now, and I'll say this collectively looking at the many comments I'm seeing screeding on my screen at the moment, go to those 2 issues. One being what Branko just raised, which is the extended use of force and the potential for long range implications from new powers and the abuse of those powers associated with managing the pandemic, and also the disinformation crisis. So if I just, Branko, you've made this point initially, and we'll come back to you in a minute, but I'd like to bring you in here, Maria, as somebody who I think possibly even today you're originally scheduled to be in court facing one of the myriad charges in a case that is due for judgment. And now I think towards the end of the month you're in court, facing charges that could see you jailed for up to 80 years. Now this is in an environment where media freedom clampdowns have been in place since the Duterte government was elected and escalating. What are you seeing there now in terms of the Duterte government's response to this crisis? Is it another lever for extending the kinds of abuses that have been reported on in connection with Rappler, with you, and with many other Filipino journalists?
I'd say more of the same, except there's a pandemic, right? So today was the verdict day for the cyber libel case. And now that's been moved to the end of the month. But I think what happened is now our government truly has to move quickly, move fast. It can't be authoritarian, because that's not the way you deal with this pandemic, right? Ironically, in a strange way, the pandemic brings in some of the solutions to some of those earlier problems. And I'll talk about them, because the first is that, facts matter in this environment. So disinformation networks that the government had cultivated all of a sudden didn't know what to do when real people who are working from home began to organize themselves and fight back and demand accountability. So that's kind of interesting. 2 nights ago, after President Duterte threatened to kill anyone who violated quarantine.
Which is quite authoritarian, right? I mean,
right. But
yeah.
Then look what happened. Right while he was talking, Filipinos went on Twitter and hashtag Oust Duterte trended #1 in the Philippines, and then went overnight and trended #1 globally. That would have been unheard of before this happened. So the first one is our government has to deliver, because where President Duterte goes, Filipinos will go. We need leadership in this time period, right? Someone needs to be the conductor of the orchestra. Otherwise, we can't effectively deal with this crisis. Then the second one is, how do you do that? You're actually going to have to pull everyone together. It's going to be social cohesion. And I think that's something the government is struggling to deal with. I'm waiting for them to reach across and get rid of the power politics, because if they don't do that, it will make it more dangerous for us. And then I guess finally, despite all of that, President Duterte went for what he always did. He asked for emergency powers and he got it. And at the last minute, there's a clause that was inserted in there that could automatically jail anyone, whether it's a journalist or anyone who posts on social media, for 2 months and then pay a fee of ₱1 million. This was snuck into this. He asked for special powers. Our Congress gave it to him in 24 hours. He also asked for a lot of money. We still, a week later, still are looking for where that's being spent. So yes, the draconian powers are there. In general, we need government to act quickly. So what does this mean? I don't know yet. I think, like novel coronavirus, this is a completely brand new world. And I like to think that that the solution to a lot of this is also here, that there is light here, because the world is completely upside down. And to be honest, press freedom took a back seat, because all of a sudden it was life and death for so many Filipinos.
And press freedom, of course, is bound up with life and death issues. As Filipinos know, but I'm saying as Filipinos know, with one of the highest rates of murder of journalists with impunity in the world. It's very hard, though, to focus on the issue of journalistic rights and freedoms in the context of, as you point out, a very deadly pandemic that has bound us all together in many ways, in dark ways. But it's, as usual, amazing to hear you speak about the lightness that might also be able to bind us together. But Branko, back to what you were saying before about these extraordinary powers that the South African government, albeit in a post-Zuma environment, has granted itself. So among those is a series of emergency laws which allow for the arrest, and I think prison sentences can be attached to this, of individuals who are accused or found guilty of creating, disseminating or publishing fake news, using inverted commas deliberately there, as a way of trying to combat disinformation, which of course is such a deadly component of this virus's and disease's trajectories. So what are you concerned about specifically in a South African context, in a country that, only 20, 30 years ago emerged from decades of authoritarian rule?
Yeah, but let me just remind you that also we had a decade, last decade of Zuma, which was, was not authoritarian, was highly corrupt age, which actually, we call it state capture times. State capture times actually decimated the power of the government to respond in today's environment, because it ballooned the government debt. We were recently downgraded by Moody's into the junk territory. So our government doesn't have much space in which to actually maneuver in order to help the collapsing economy. As you know, the economies are collapsing all over the world, and if actually anybody needs to see the cost of state capture, the cost of corruption in a real life, it's happening right now. Because our government actually has to go to the IMF to look for help, because a lot of money has been stolen, and sadly, even more money has been misspent and wasted away. In terms of the powers, look, may I just say one thing, is that whoever is spreading fake news is a horrible human being. Whoever is spreading fake news in this environment, I hope they burn in hell. I just want to point it out before I start anything else, because the level of immorality of that is just fascinating to me and horrifying to me. Yeah. Look, in terms of the government's fight against fake news, every law can have a good intention, but how is it going to be used? That's the issue, And the ANC government is actually quite polarized, quite divided, depending on which minister belongs to which faction within the ANC. Some of them would love to use those provisions. Some of them would not, care about that much. So the jury is out there. However, it is a law which is highly scary. And let me just give you another idea. Is that what government did as well? They essentially declared prohibition. You cannot buy alcohol these days in South Africa. Just to clarify, I don't drink alcohol, so I don't care about it, but it's not a personal issue. However, it's been used by the army and the soldiers, the army and the police, to go out and harass people in the communities, in townships, right. Which and that was quite a few of them used it in such a way that was humiliating as well. So as we published the story last night, the legitimacy of the state is being eroded very strongly when those provisions of the law are being used and abused, and actually open to use and abuse. And I don't think it's that as bad as in the Philippines, but again, whoever is actually applying that law, they have an extraordinary amount of power. And just to clarify, we're not in a state of emergency, a state of disaster. So state of emergency, which may or may not happen depending on how the curve is going up, basically is gonna take away just about all human rights we have, all rights we have, possibly including the right to freedom of expression. So again, we were lucky so far, but we are really watching them like hawks. Especially, I mean, we're publishing quite a few stories. We actually do probably 3 or 4 stories a day, literally pointing out in those issues, because we don't want people to just stop caring and stop watching that, because it's such a crucial issue. We have to fight the pandemic, but we also have to fight for human fundamental rights, and we cannot see it to government without a really good reason for that.
It strikes me that there are 3 struggles here. One is for physical survival, for humanity's physical survival. The second is for the maintenance of human rights, particularly from where we're sitting, the rights to freedom of expression and privacy, Absolutely. The right to bring stories to our audiences and hold government's account. And the third is essentially, the right to defend ourselves against the kind of disinformation that is swirling and threatening currently. So Ritu, can I ask you, in the context of these threats that Maria and Branko have been talking about, we can see tools of the state being exaggerated, escalated around the world, and they include, this is not specific necessarily to India, but they include increased surveillance of citizens, which has been a huge issue, of course, in India. They include takedowns of content on the grounds that they may or may not be in breach of particular government edicts around public health communications. We've seen content removed on the basis that it's connected to disinformation. And we have seen the criminalisation of journalism effectively, potentially, via the enactment of these sorts of laws. So in India, which has, got such a strong tradition of feisty journalism, which has in recent years been facing significant challenge, what are your biggest concerns from the point of view of your operation in particular, but journalism more broadly in India, when it comes to the tendency towards totalitarianism and to increase, regulations on the press?
I'm just going to step back and give you a little bit of context. We've been the 140th among 180 countries on World Press Freedom Index. So we've been really, pretty badly off on press freedom to begin with. Economically, our economy has been a downspin all of last year. So media houses have been commercially crippled already. And of course, it is a totalitarian approach, which is using a lot of regulatory policies to let any independent voice be further crippled. And we have seen that ourselves as an organization. So you're already in a situation which has already got you hemmed in. We've already, ever since the beginning, there have been threats of arrest if you're putting out anything that is fake, or threats of arrest if you're seen putting out anything that is inflammatory. But we've had an instance, not us, but the Economic Times in India has had a journalist being beaten up while trying to report from a location on the pandemic. We've had, I've got to give you a little bit more of a context.
Sure.
It's known that the current government is a little more inclined towards a Hindu nation. There has been, though it says on the face of it, it is not, but it is. And there has been, if I was to go back to November, December, and January, for the first time, we've seen nationwide protests against this government, because under the garb of a Citizenship Act or the National Register of Citizenship that was being rolled out, they said, throughout the country, and then there was a pushback, so they sort of stepped back on it. But essentially, what the outcome of this new policy by the government would have been, that it would have been very, very difficult for somebody who was a Muslim, who did not have documents of his birth or his parents' birth, or some proof of owning land, which a lot of us are very, very poor and we do not have documents. So it's very easy for us to not have proof of citizenship. But effectively, to cut a long story short, it would have been, if you were a Hindu and you didn't have the documents, you would have made it through. But if you were a Muslim, you would have found it very, very difficult to get accepted as a citizen of the country, even if you had 5 generations living in this country. And there was that sentiment as it is. And there was a lot of us who were reporting from the ground on the anti-CAA Citizenship Amendment Act protests across the country. There were several of us who were already roughed up and beaten up for being the voice of the protesters. Some of our journalists being among them. So there was already an environment of journalists being pushed back and being told to shut up, and or the fact that, you're only putting out the point of view of the protesters, you're not putting out the other point of view. So there was already a very, very communalized, very polarized environment. Unfortunately, among the fake news, the kind of fake news that's doing the rounds is, of course, all the fake cures and all of that, that's globally. What is happening in this country is that the communal aspect is now creeping into the fake news. So the fake news machinery is also generating fake news saying that the Muslim community is trying to spread the infection.
Right, which is just so many layers of threat rolled up there.
Unfortunately, as it so happened, while there have been several Hindu religious gatherings even post the lockdown, unfortunately, there was one large gathering in New Delhi. It's called the Tablighi Jamaat of a Muslim sect that had a gathering, which had several people who had traveled in from Indonesia and Malaysia and several other parts of the country. Unfortunately, as it so happens, several deaths, they have turned out to be super spreaders, and there have been several deaths when contact mapping has taken place from the people who came here. So unfortunately, the communal agenda is getting further fueled at this time of the pandemic, where in most other parts of the world, all the other problems are slightly suppressed, and it's the pandemic that's come to the fore. Here, that is happening with as much ferocity as it was happening pre the pandemic. So that is the other fake news issue that is a concern for us to report, because the government is putting out data which is only a reflection of very poor or very little testing. And now as journalists, we know from the ground, from our Stringer network, that the numbers are much higher, because people are meeting people in hospitals, or we're getting numbers from doctors or hospitals or communities stating that the numbers are much higher, and we are verifying them. But we have to be very careful on how we put that out, because any data that is conflicting the government data can be, that can be seen as fake news. And and the cases can be against you. The Wire, as you might already know, already has an FIR against it, and there are threats of arrest happening. So it's a mess. It's very messy. And therefore, psychologically, my journalists were already in a very, very edgy space, because of everything they were dealing with in the protest space, and now it's that plus this. So everyone's at edge.
Yeah, huge stress in combination with genuine threats, whether they're physical threats in terms of acts of violence against journalists for doing their jobs, or you're perceived to, represent one part of society or another, but also, as you described there, the threats that are coming from the criminalization of fake news, in inverted commas again, which is being used in many places around the world in settings where press freedom is particularly weak, to bring down content, to arrest journalists and so on. So Maria, if I can come to you, given that you are at the very sharp end of what this can look like when it's cumulative, when it's being waged, as you refer to it as lawfare, used against journalists in the Philippines, as much as, despite being under direct risk of imprisonment yourself right now, saying that these issues have had to take a slightly back step. What do you think needs to be done by the global journalism community, by international civil society, and any other agencies that can provide assistance with shining a light on these issues? What needs to be done now?
So I think one of the things, I was just on the phone with the International Press Institute, right? They actually are monitoring all of these instances, right? As of today, they had 73 attacks on journalists and restrictions on media. There's a website that's there. We need to keep track of it. But the next part of this as well is that, again, this emergency powers law, the government no longer has to go through a legal process. They are now just handing out subpoenas to everyone who they believe could be captured in this law. And there's a lot, including a mayor who's from an opposition party who's just trying to do his job, right? Now they can just put them in jail. Beyond that, beyond the information, we're also in a place where if you are outside after curfew, you can also just be arrested. And then because there's no court system, you can't post bail. So, it's kind of very topsy-turvy right now in the Philippines. And, I think it'll show you how much the world has changed for us, because in the past, this would be what Rappler is on. Human rights. We would be demanding it, but it is very hard. Like Branko, we still do the stories on it, but even more important than that are the people who are dying, can't get their medicines, can't get food. We walked into an environment, in Asia, like in India, physical distance. There are areas in the urban poor where, like our jails, where people are packed So that is a breeding ground for it. Those people have not yet gotten food, many of them. So some of our poor are saying, we're afraid we're going to die of starvation before the virus gets us.
Which is, as you say, the most essential human suffering. That's the experience that has to be emphasized while we have an eye on the other threats as well. Just on that experience of citizens in your countries and trying to ensure that they have access to reliable information. I mean, you referred a moment ago, Ritu, to the fake cures doing the rounds. So the World Health Organization is really anxious, as is the UN broadly, about the role that disinformation is playing in essentially fanning and fueling the pandemic by either providing wrong advice or, whether it's a drug that has some sort of presidential authority attached to it that results in people dying when they take, medication that's not fit for purpose, for example. What are you doing in your daily work with your communities of journalists and audiences to try and address some of this disinformation, to ensure that at least where information can help them, whether it's around access to medicine or food, for example, is able to actually get to them in this swamp of disinformation?
The fact check is something that we've always been very particular about and very, very focused and strong on as well. As you know, it's called WebCoof, and we've had a strong team focused on just fact checking. What we have done now is actually we've repurposed our entire newsroom because, no one's doing sports coverage. There's very little entertainment coverage So we have bolstered the fact check team to have more people. And they have also connected again with stringers and journalists and partnered with journalists who may not be the Quint journalists, but across the country, so that we're able to. We also have always had a health website, which we call FIT. Courtesy that, we have a massive panel of doctors. So we've been able to tap into them as far as the medical aspect of, putting out facts against fake cures. So we've been able to do that pretty effectively. And alongside that, we've repurposed the teams to focus on two other things. One is FAQs, so that we can be putting out not just what is fake, but also putting out answers to a lot of questions which need to be answered, so that people don't then fall for the first thing that they come across as an answer. And we're also focusing one team towards solutions journalism, who are now looking for whatever solutions, either immediate solutions in terms of prevention or testing, or, for instance, we have a real paucity of ventilators, or just healthcare, or even just PPEs for doctors. As of just yesterday, 10 doctors have tested positive in this country, as far as we know. So solutions journalism, FAQs under legal, lockdown, medical, as well as policies, and of course, beefed up our fact checking and done a pan-India network. So I was in fact thinking that when we emerge from this, we'll be actually that much stronger as a team on fact checking. So that's the actually silver lining to this terrible situation otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to try and highlight those. And I should say for the audience that Rappler and Daily Maverick and The Quint and the three editors with you featured in a series of reports that I wrote with Nabila Shabir and Felix Simon for the Reuters Institute at the University of Oxford. We did a detailed study on the work that these news organizations have been doing, including looking at combating disinformation. So that was, of course, in the pre-COVID era. But for people looking to try and dig into the kinds of methods and approaches being used by these guys, I recommend those reports to you. They're available online for free. So Ritu has given us some outstanding examples. You mentioned WebCoof, which is your collaborative fact-checking network, the application of solutions journalism. Branko, what are you doing in South Africa where disinformation has not only been prolific and connected to state capture, the weaponization of disinformation by the Zuma presidency, and the links, of course, to assaults and attacks on journalists connected to that disinformation, as experienced by many Daily Maverick reporters. But in this environment where disinformation is, potentially much deadlier, what are you doing journalistically to try and deal with this?
Similar to what Ritu said, we started a series of fact-checking articles where we analyze especially the disinformation that's been spread on WhatsApp groups, because they're so difficult to, they're not exposed to public scrutiny that easily. So we do that. We also have a similar to Ritu's team FAQ, and we also in our articles, throughout our articles are careful, and from our point of view, it's very important that we actually get the facts straight and reliable. So it's a multi-pronged approach. We have a slightly, I don't know how it is in other countries, but we have a interesting situation in South Africa, is that one of our biggest media houses is actually one of the biggest purveyors of fake news, which is ridiculous.
Awkward and difficult.
Awkward, yeah. There's so-called independent news media. They've been purchased by one of the local businessmen who was highly corrupt, and who is actually using his newspapers for his personal wars. Daily Maverick is one of his biggest targets, me included. So I'll give you an example. We have created we have something which is created in the last couple of days in South Africa, which is called Solidarity Fund, where some of the country's richest people really invested a lot of money in order to help. The businesses, small businesses, survive this chaos, and we're talking about $200 million was invested in personal money by these guys. Independent news media has been spreading on every front page of their newspapers, and we're talking about I think they have altogether 10 or 12 newspapers. That is the basically spreading the news that this is something horrible, and that we should not accept it. I mean, in a kind of the simplest way. So that's a bit of a different situation. There's another thing that we tell everybody is that if a politician or media personality or business person he is supported by an army of bots, there's a pretty good kind of measurement that something is wrong with them, and something is wrong with the honesty and decency. But again, there is no set of rules, and it is literally day by day, and just hammer them back and hammer them back and hammer them back, and you actually cannot rest, because the ability of the fake news purveyors to actually come up with the new concepts and crazier concepts is actually unmatched by us, I must admit.
It's a huge challenge.
Yeah. It is unfortunately continuous battle. There is just no simple solution for that one.
And I think it's an important point that you make. I come from Australia, where the Australian Murdoch press is often held up as an example of the problem that exists.
Awkward.
Yeah. So I understand that, but I mean, I think this is an important point that highlights the need to kind of reinforce ethical, independent, credible journalism as one of the antidotes to disinformation, as much as it can do. But to Maria, you developed something called the Shark Tank, which is a huge database full of information about disinformation networks, as well as the sort of narratives connected to disinformation in the Philippines. Can you just talk to us a little bit about perhaps how you're using that effort to deal with disinformation, and any other initiatives you've started, particularly in light of COVID?
Sure. So the Shark Tank is a database. It's more than a terabyte now of disinformation networks, networks that were created, that Facebook would call it coordinated inauthentic behavior, right? The difference, though, is that we put it in the context of the entire information ecosystem of the Philippines. So we want to chart and map how something spreads through our information ecosystem. we've been doing this work since 2016. That was when the disinformation networks, when social media was weaponized here. Now, what's so interesting is, like the rest of the world, we are finding, the disinformation about China and its role in the crisis, right? Is it helping everybody, or is it where it began, or is it really in the United States? Those things are here as well. But simultaneously, and I'll do the silver lining again, we are seeing real people, Filipinos now, who weren't able to, or didn't have time, or didn't care. Now, in Metro Manila alone, you have how many? 14 million stuck in their homes, all on their phones. And when the president gives an address, or when something happens, or when they don't have food, this is where we all are. And what we're seeing is real people now are coming in, and civic engagement. People were pushed to digital, and now real people are fighting the disinformation networks. And these are, I guess, this is also where we'll see the solutions, right? Not only, it's going to begin in communities, in real world communities, because that's how you're going to be able to find contact tracing. That's how you're going to distribute food. But also in the virtual world, those real world communities, we're going to be forced to really work together and demand accountability from our leaders.
So you just mentioned there, Maria, the citizens on their phones, being active participants in both, the storytelling and the disinformation busting. And Ritu, you also mentioned the use of UGC, user-generated content, as being more important, and through your citizen journalism network as well. We have a question from one of our journalists in the audience who wants to know, what are the ethics involved here? What are the ethical challenges if we're having to rely increasingly on citizens? What about protecting their privacy if they're posting something, whether it's public or private? Are we thinking about those sorts of issues as we strive to kind of, fill channels of news output with this sort of citizen content? I know that it's something that we've dealt with now for over a decade in terms of social media generated content, but in this particular context, what do you think? We'll start with you, Ritu, the urgent lessons might be.
So we've always been very, very particular about informing every citizen journalist on what it will be to have their identity revealed in the context of whatever their story is, and not just asking them if they're okay with their identity to be revealed, also telling them what the consequences could possibly be. We also educate them on how maybe they could tell their story without involving themselves directly. But equally so, it's equally important for us to have cross-verification of what we're getting from people not trained to be journalists, or people who could have an agenda to put that story out. So the challenge equally is, very often you're following the story with the citizen reporter, and you're taking it to quite, you have a journalist in the newsroom spending a lot of time with that person, and then you get the feeling that it may not be everything that a citizen journalist is claiming it is, in which case you, having spent that kind of time, you do drop that story. Similarly, as part of WebCoo for our fact checking, we're currently inundated with people sending us their stories that they want verified, which they found on WhatsApp or some other social media platform. And we ask them, would you want your name to be, if we are putting the fact check story out, not only to be replied to the person who sent it with an email saying this is the details, this is true or not true, and this is the process by which we arrived at it. But we also ask them, are you okay with your name being put out? If they say yes, I want to be associated with this, we again tell them what the perils could be, and then if they're still okay, we put that out. So we are very, very, we know what it is to be a journalist in this country, so we know what it is to be a citizen journalist. Definitely. And there have been instances where after we put the story down, we've been requested to bring it down, and we have. So
by the citizen reporter or the subject.
By the citizen reporter.
Yeah, for their safety and protection. Yeah. Okay, some great tips and examples there. Another question, in fact, from my former colleague Nabila Shabir, about what your audiences are asking for at this time, and how you're responding to their needs. That's one for you, I think, Maria, and then I have another saved for you, Branko, before we wind up.
Facts. This is also, that's, I think, part of the reason that we're moving back into the age of the experts, right? We need facts. We need experts who know. And journalists need to get that out there. So I think that's the first step. The second one is, how do I protect my family? How do I protect myself? Or something even more basic, where can I get food? Where can I get drugs? How can I ask government for the money I need to buy food? So like Ritu and like Branko, we have civic engagement at two levels. There's the citizen journalists. There is a community of fact checkers that we work with. We just did a webinar today on fact checking, very well attended through the Philippines. And then the last one is our members. These are people who, we started this membership model in December of 2018. Originally, they came in because they shared the same values as Rappler to fight for democracy. And now they're the people who are pushing to actually not just, once they get the facts, to go do something with it in the real world. This is a time when journalism matters the most. The mission is incredibly important, and we need to nudge our governments to make sure that, facts that they don't like, how many people are there, like China, whether it's really released all of the information about this virus.
Can I just ask you a follow-up question there? I mean, we've talked about what's happening with regards to overreach in the global south. What about Europe and the US, North America? Can I get you to reflect, perhaps Maria? I know, when we've spoken before, you've referred to the fact that many of the threats you're facing often predate the kinds of threats that will creep towards the West. So, is there any behaviors that you're witnessing in the West, for example, from political leaders or tech companies or wherever, that in reference to COVID-19 responses you're concerned about?
I think Presidents Trump and Duterte had a similar approach, which was, they said they took strong action. In the case of President Duterte, it was lockdown, and then it's up to the local government to execute, which was why it made it very disjointed. The same thing is happening in the United States. Now it's a little more, President Trump has shifted. What Filipino experts quote Anthony Fauci, So I think again, both presidents are going to have to deal with facts. I think the other thing, and here's another silver lining, how in the last 4 years I've been railing about we're frenemies with Facebook, right? We want social media, who are now technically the gatekeepers to facts, to information, to be gatekeepers. Guess what? Under COVID-19, during this pandemic, they're being forced to do that. Twitter took down Bolsonaro's tweets because it was going to kill people if they didn't.
And Robert Giuliani.
And Robert Giuliani. Yes, Robert Giuliani. Yes.
Yeah.
So again, small things. I think, we want to take some of these things and then build on them. But again, I don't know what the world is going to look like.
And this is the key question, isn't it? What does this mean? What does the COVID-19 pandemic look like for the future of humanity? Which is just a massive series of questions for all of us to probe and consider. But what does it mean for journalism, do you think? We're seeing some incredible disruption. I know we're in the midst of this upheaval and storm now, and it's very difficult to pull back, despite our efforts today to try and do so, to analyse where this might be heading. But Branko, Daily Maverick, like The Quint and Rappler, has built a very loyal community of followers, audience members, collaborators. What, if anything, are you hearing from them that you think is relevant to thinking about ways in which we can ensure the sustainability of journalism, and where do you think this is headed in terms of journalism's survival or response to this crisis?
Okay, before I respond to that, just want to tell you, every time I hear Maria and Ritu, I feel incredibly luxurious, and I feel how easy we have it in South Africa. I just want to point out we are really lucky here, fortunate here. Look, to go back what Maria said, as long as we provide facts, we will be fulfilling our duty to the society. We also, I think, we need to be thought leaders. There's a high likelihood that the world is not going to be the same. Even if we manage to, as a civilization, defeat COVID-19. And as Maria said, this is the global pandemic, and we are as good as the weakest link in this process. So, in terms of time that we're going to spend on fighting this, I'm pretty sure that we lost 2020 already. So now, if you lose a year, the catastrophic effect is going to have down the line for people who actually were already struggling to begin with. It's just going to be massive. It's going to be massive catastrophe. So what we need to do, I think, what our job is and our duty is right now, is to convince enough people and a sufficient number of chunks of society, to call it that way, to actually understand that that media is basically one of the last guardians against chaos, against entropy. And I think one of the only ways we can do it is to just be sterling in what we do, and just I tell my guys, we are built for this. We cannot actually let it go now. We are built for this, and and even in the letter we send them when we announced the work from home, we said every time South Africa needed us, we responded to it. It started with Marikana massacre. I'm not going to bore you with too much, but end up with Gupta leaks and others. The reality is that our country needs us. Our country needs us to function. Our country needs us to be clear-eyed, and it needs to be actually importantly, resolute in our thinking and in our delivery. And unfortunately, depending on a country, depending on a media house, depending on all these things, I don't think the picture is going to be good. I think that we're going to end up, especially the independent media houses in the world, we're going to end up being a massive casualty of COVID-19. And I just want to put it out there. This is the level of catastrophe that we haven't seen probably since the World War II. So what is the solution? I don't know, to be honest, Julie. I think it's the baseline is to deliver our jobs, deliver what we're supposed to deliver, our mandate to society at the best possible level that we can, and then from there we need to build up this new method in how we actually going to survive. And again, it is entirely possible that the entire independent media is globally is going to be wiped out. As somebody said the other day, it's a virus that sets the deadlines in this specific one, nobody else. And as Maria said, coronavirus, it cannot be tweeted away by presidents and cannot be shouted away by presidents. It can't be shot at by presidents. But it also, it's going to define how many of us live, sadly. So all I can say is that, we cannot stop being who we are. We cannot stop, we cannot lose the clarity of what, our vision and the dedication to our mission. And these are the moments where it actually really counts. And only if you do that, we have a chance to actually convince our societies that we need to exist for them.
Profound and motivating, Branko. Thank you. Ritu, can I come to you, and then we'll finish with a response from Maria. Branko has outlined, a range of incredible challenges and kind of, insights as we go through this. From your point of view, where are we headed, and what can we do as a global journalism community to ensure as many people survive as possible, but also that independent journalism can survive?
I'm going to use a quote from Maria, and she said, I've heard her say this often, that to be independent, you've got to survive. And I, in a country right now, we're testing 31 2 per million. So, while we have that entire massive challenge as a nation on just testing enough so that we can, and then finding the means to treat enough, and therefore survival in many, many ways. But I think, in a country where independent or critical media has been under threat already, I think we've got to be very, very, at some stage, we'll have to become slightly practical and unemotional about how we're going to survive. What are the costs that we can do without? How are we going to remodel ourselves depending on how this plays out? I think still for us, it's still very, very early days of the pandemic. We'll really understand what the economic implications are for a country that was already in a very, very strapped economic situation. We'd been talking about, in my conversation with various media houses, I'm hearing this again and again, that we've been talking about remodeling ourselves and playing to our strengths for a while, but now this situation has precipitated that. But, in an ideal situation, when you would have remodeled in a certain way. Right now, re-looking at your business, every time we sit and brainstorm on what's the best way towards survival, you realize that there is a new challenge that's popped up. So it's almost like you want to blank out that thinking and really focus on good reporting and doing what you really need to do at this point. But I think at some point, maybe not right away, but very soon, we're already hearing of large legacy media houses in India already doing salary cuts. We're already hearing some rumblings of layoffs. And, it is very, very worrisome. And yet the important thing, like Branko said, it is so important for us, for the voice, like the voice of Maria or the voice of Daily Maverick or like the voice of The Quint in India, for us to survive, because a lot of the media in India is already succumbed to be the voice of the government. So it's important for us to survive. What do we need to do to survive? At some point, it'll be a very, very hard, cold look at what we need to do. And, we've just been postponing that decision. But at some point, we'll have to look at that.
And that, the correlation is the desperate need for donor funding, without strings attached, whether it's from, NGOs internationally, from philanthropists, or where states can actually...
Or like I've been saying, maybe this is really the time to also appeal, if so to say, to the guilt of the large platforms who have been, siphoning off the revenue from news publishers. Maybe this is time to, if not give back, to partner more comprehensively and not in these. I know there are conversations about Facebook, etc., but I think it has to be far more substantial than that, because we need each other to survive. They need us as well as we need them. So I really think it's really, really time for more comprehensive conversations to happen there, because I know that I can't turn to my government for any media support.
Yeah, it's not Canada.
I know that philanthropy is not a huge source of funding in this country.
Yeah.
So those two are not, so we'll have to find our own sources, maybe become that much more aggressive when the world comes back to normal on ad selling. But I think we don't know when the world is going to come back to normal.
Exactly. Yeah.
Where will it be when it comes to that, and how much will it take for us to come back to anything like the world we know, or whether that will happen at all, and whether revenue models need to be rethought. We've been self-funded so far, and that's not a sustainable model.
No, certainly not. So, but I mean, despite the fact that you're investing, so much of your own savings, in this. So I think that's a really important point, Ritu. And Maria, perhaps if I can get you to riff off that to start with, as somebody who refers to herself as a frenemy of Facebook's and, the other social platforms and internet communications companies, is it time for no strings attached, serious bailout money that might be, whether you call it guilt money or whether you call it compensation for years of exploitation of content created by independent journalism? Is it time for that? And what does it look like if it is?
It's hard to answer that because, yes, both, Facebook, Google, they are offering money, but it is still kind of scattered. In the US, IFCN is where Facebook money is going through. Let me just describe exactly what the world is, because sometimes we don't take time to do that. This is an extinction event. This is like moving from the time of the dinosaurs to the next stage. And this is an extinction event, not just for journalists who determine the quality of a participative democracy. It is also an extinction event for a way of life that was pre-COVID-19. I think this is what I'm already embracing. This morning I sat in an off-the-record conversation with a former prime minister, former trade minister, and somebody who was looking at the future. They were saying that the soonest they can think of getting the world back economically to where we were before this pandemic is a minimum of 5 years. 5 years. Imagine malls where, and here's a crucial question we need to answer. If you get this virus, are you immune like measles, or is it like getting the common cold? If you're immune like measles, then we will recover much faster. But if it is like the common cold, this virus will mutate and we will have to keep our physical distance from each other, which means malls are not going to make money, which means we have not seen anything like this. So how does that come to our business as journalists? I think definitely if you care about democracy, if you care about facts, and we're now starting to see Facebook, Twitter, social media platforms do care about facts, because now if they don't have the facts, lies kill. All of a sudden we are all in the same boat. We are all working from home and we need facts. So strangely enough, I am optimistic. But of all of those things I just said, which are quite depressing, here's the part that I think is really positive. It's a new world we can create. And we're going to have to find new ways of serving our communities in each of our countries that somehow come up together, because the three biggest problems that we're facing are global in nature: climate, truth, the battle for facts, and the virus.
Thank you so much, the three of you. It's been an extraordinary conversation with insights and challenges and opportunities and even some silver lining as we go back into the world, as self-isolated as it is for those of us who are in a privileged enough position to be able to self-isolate. Let's be frank. All I can say is at this point, please stay safe, and thank you to all of the people. We've had a big audience here and many questions flying through. I've tried to aggregate as many of them as I could to put to our guests. We will share online through stories and resources in the Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum that ICFJ is operating, and also on our various social media platforms using the hashtag covering COVID. To keep in touch with you as the weeks and months, who knows how long, this situation continues. Just by way of update, next week I'll be hosting a panel on Thursday, a webinar like this with David Kay, the UN Special Rapporteur Freedom of Expression, and Courtney Radge, who's the Committee to Protect Journalists Head of Advocacy. So we'll pick up on some of these issues with those people whose job it is to kind of have our backs, if you like, in journalism. And also I've just spent the past week working on a briefing paper for the UN with academic colleagues, looking at some of the challenges around responding to disinformation and what the implications are for journalism. So very soon, hopefully, we'll be able to share some of those findings with you as well. And all I want to say now is go forth in a spirit of collaboration, trying to do our best to keep governments and political leaders accountable, and fight for facts, as Maria Ressa in the Philippines and Ritu Kapur in New Delhi and Branko Brkic somewhere in the Karoo Desert of South Australia have shared with us. Yeah, so please, everybody stay in touch, stay connected, and be safe, most of all. That's all from ICFJ this afternoon. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much.
Very much. Thank you. Thank you
Thanks.
all.
Bye-bye.